Good morning. This is the Writing Great Dialogue panel, which we all tend to do. And we're going to talk about what is good dialogue, what works, what doesn't work, and talk about different examples. We'll do a lot of question and answer. We primarily work in animation. I think some of us have done some comics as well, but that's where we're going to pretty much discuss. If you're looking for dialogue in novels, completely different thing. But dialogue in live action television and movies works the same way as in animation. So it applies throughout any kind of dramatic presentation. We're going to start with introductions. And I'm going to ask each panelist to say a little bit about themselves. And we'll start with, on my left, Joelle Selner.
Hi, I'm Joelle. Primarily an animation writer. I've written on Sonic Boom, Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Lego Friends currently, and just a bunch of other stuff that you may or may not have heard of. I've done some comics and graphic novels. And I also write Hallmark movies. It's kind of an odd convergence of things. And yeah, I just do a lot of dialogue all the time.
Mark Hoffmeyer.
My name is Mark Hoffmeyer. I've written for Spider-Man the Animated Series, for the animated Back to the Future. I've done almost 30 episodes of Power Rangers, including the first 3 seasons of Power Rangers. I've written for Lego, and I've also written several games, including Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, would be my favorite.
I'm Matt Wayne. I'm Matt Wayne. I've written for most recently Nico and the Sword of Light on Amazon, Cannon Busters on Netflix, and in the past I've written for Superhero Squad and Justice League and stuff like that.
Okay, and I'm Craig Miller. I've written a lot of animation, from the real Ghostbusters to Curious George and the Smurfs to Beast Wars and G.I. Joe, and a lot of different things in live action, like episodes of The Hunger and even Murder, She Wrote. Anyway, so we're going to talk about writing dialogue and what makes it good. If you read the description of it, or better still, if you haven't read the description, I wrote the description, so I included a quote from Harrison Ford, who on Star Wars said to George Lucas, "You can write this shit, George, but you can't say it." Because there's a big difference between what you can write on paper and what reads well in your mind when you're reading it off of a page, and what it sounds like when you're talking, when you're speaking out loud. And it's hard to imagine that, but it really is, and you can try it sometime looking at dialogue anywhere. But some things are just hard to say. Too many S's next to each other, too many T's and D's next to each other. You just can't say those words, even though they read fine in your head, just not coming out of your mouth. What do you think is required when you're thinking about dialogue to write a competent line of dialogue? I'm not talking about the line that everyone will be quoting for 20 years, just competent dialogue in a scene. What do you have to be thinking about?
I just want to say I'm happy that I'm here and have been promoted from the writing mediocre dialogue panel. So, yeah, it was. I think one of the basic tools you have to have as a writer is you have to be an observer, and that includes being a good listener. So listening to how people talk, listening to how people say, watching people, everybody's their own character. including ourselves. And so you can listen to what people say. The sort of art of it becomes then that, you know, in actual life, you're not looking to advance a story, but in a script, you're looking to advance a story. So whereas someone might get off the phone with you and say, okay, well, I'll talk to you later. Sounds good, bye. If you're writing that in a scene, that doesn't really advance the story. So if you're looking to button the scene or propel the story forward, you might end that with the person you're looking at on the phone saying, well, I'm going to find out what Raymond was up to. And then hang up the phone. Because now you're advancing the story, you're raising a question, you're pushing things forward. So it's sort of the art of it comes from taking what sounds good in life, but then adding the layer of making it something that is going to advance the story for you in a way that seems natural, but is actually sort of artificial because you're pushing the story forward.
And the trick of that is to make it sound like it's natural and not that you are just deliberately only telling the story. Like it could be a conversation people are having.
What helped me a lot starting out was I would read everything out loud, and felt like if I couldn't say it and I couldn't pronounce it, an actor's not going to be able to do that. So it really helps just, you know, read the pages. And what I do now, I have a little bit of a cheat. I use voice-activated software. So when I'm reading my script into my version of Final Draft, I can change lines to make them sound more natural if there's something to bump on.
I guess that's what people with good diction do. When I use voice-activated stuff, that always comes up garbage. One thing in Mark's example of hanging up the phone, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens in real life that you don't use stuff. You know, usually people are like, okay, I'll see you when you get home or something like that. Stuff that you might need in the moment, but not in a scene about it. In you know, the back and forth of the okay, goodbye, 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 and then hanging up the phone. That's not necessary.
In fact, it's almost become a joke that no one on
do,
television actually says goodbye. They just hang up the phone.
Yeah. Because in the 70s, that's how we got from one scene to another.
Well, and the other thing I remember, you know, when I took screenwriting courses and, you know, working on scripts and stuff, one of the classic things that they warn you against is, and when you're a young writer, you can't avoid it, you're trying to get exposition out, and the problem is, so you end up then with the artificial construct of someone talking on the phone, but you're not hear what the other person is saying on the end of a phone. So a natural conversation would be, yeah, well, by 7:30. Well, that's not what I told him. But if you know, when you're young and you're writing, you'd be like, what do you mean they're not going to be there by 7:30? I told them they had to pick up the Dodge Challenger by then. What do you mean they got their driver's license taken away with that drink driving there was 2 years ago? You know, you got both ends of the phone. Right, so you can hear the conversation.
It's just deadly, and I see it like when I'm watching something. It really just it's like nails on the chalkboard for me, where you see someone say, "Oh, hey, my brother that I haven't seen for 17 years."
Yeah.
Like, who says that? Like there's other ways, like more subtle ways to get the information across.
For me, one of the things that grates on me now are the give me the gun scenes, because I think we've seen that trope. We've seen that trope played out for so many years now. Television is old enough that we, you know, the first time we had a scene where a guy was holding a gun, you know, you gotta do it. I'm like, come on, man, just give me the gun. Come on, just give me the gun, it'll be okay. But now you see it on TV, and it's like, oh my God, it's a give me the gun scene. It just happened the other day. I was working in my office, and I had a rerun of
Sesame Street.
Law and Order. Follow Sesame Street, so I don't watch it anymore. There was a Law and Order Criminal Intent, and there's Vincent D'Onofrio, and I'm like, there's people in the room, and the woman has a gun, and I'm like, is he give me the gun scene? Is he going to say, give me the gun? And then it came up, just give me the gun, it'll be okay. I was so happy. I think one thing people sometimes don't get about our industry, and especially what we do, is it can be very collaborative. A lot of times, as writers and when we're producing stuff, we will be at the records. So you get, the nice thing about that is, you know, you can't be too married to dialogue, right? I think it was Hemingway that said you got to be prepared to murder your babies, right? When he was talking about writing and stuff that you're really precious with. So Will actually sit and records, and I remember when I worked with Matt on Superhero Squad, you have a very talented, cast of actors. Why can't I think of his name right now? Iron Man.
Tom Kenny.
Tom Kenny. And so they'll read the dialogue, and sometimes they'll go, boy, that just doesn't sound right. And you'll either change it up there, or sometimes in the case of somebody like Tom Kenny, he'll say, can I try something? Sure, try it. And so you refine it while you're on the fly, and sometimes, it takes hearing that character say something to say, oh, okay, that did or didn't work.
And on the flip side, sometimes you have very untalented actors.
Yeah.
And you have to be prepared to rewrite the dialogue so that they can pronounce things. And you'll learn that some actors in comedy don't have comedic timing. So you know that the next time you're writing a script for them, do not give them any of the funny lines, because it's not going to land.
Yeah, and sometimes they send voice work, when we're talking about animation, they send the voice work up to Canada, and they have it recorded by Canadians, who are normally very fine people, but they say some words funny.
What are you talking about?
Yeah, well, I had a line where a character had to say, these characters had a rope, and they went to lasso someone with it, throw the rope over their head and grab them, and the actor could not say lasso. He kept saying lasso.
Yep.
Yep. And we went through that line like 6 times, and finally we just said, okay, it's lasso.
It's rope.
Yeah, I went through that with an actress. The line had headless horseman in it, and she kept on saying horseless headman. And we ended up just leaving it in. It's like, well,
No, it's a joke.
it's kind of funny when she says it, and she isn't supposed to be the brightest character, so let's go with horseless headman.
I was going to say, one of the fun challenges, and I know Matt has faced this, both writing Marvel specials for Lego, which he's done and I've done, and I know Joelle's done work for Lego, is that you have to find it's pretty easy when you're creating your own characters. You're setting their voices and you're setting their tone, and so if you want to have that guy say a line a certain way, well, you've created it. But sometimes you're faced with a situation like if you're writing for Lego and you're using the Marvel Cinematic Universe and you're writing the Lego version of Thor for a special, well, he's got to not only be Thor, he's also got to be the Lego snarky version of Thor. And I would always push snarky Thor as far as I could and have him say these and thous and verilies, trying to make it ridiculous. And I'd always get the note back, Thor can't be silly, but he should be funny. And it's like, it's a real challenge, and you have to come up with ways. In one of the specials I did where they're setting up for a party in Avengers Tower, and I had to think of a way to, Iron Man came in with a bowl of meatballs, and I had to have Thor, Iron Man says, somebody's going to have to reheat the meatballs, and Thor says, that is job for now. And he eats the meatballs with. But I would have an original line that made him sound more ridiculous, and I got to know, well, that's too ridiculous for Thor. So sometimes you have all these competing interests.
Something too ridiculous for Thor. But that is the case. Sometimes we have the luxury of having created a show and the characters. And other times you're coming in to write, whether it's Lego or not, write established characters on an established show that someone else created, and you have to be able to follow the pattern they've set up for that show. That's one of the jobs of a writer. If you're coming into something that's established, you have to match what they've done at the same time that you're coming up with a new and interesting story. It still has to be those same characters who speak in the same way.
Yeah.
So you can't ignore what has come before. You have to pay attention and abide by that.
And in a well-crafted show, no character is going to sound the same. So if you write a line, you have to make sure it's something that specific character would say. Like I always use Friends as an example. Like Monica wouldn't say a Chandler line. Like they were very distinct character voices, and you have to go into, especially when you're coming into existing IP, think about like, is this how the character would act? Is this what the character would say? Is that going to sound weird coming out of the character's mouth?
Yeah, I think it's important that characters sound real. I think, Mark, you mentioned this, listening and paying attention to people around you. It has to sound like a real person. It shouldn't sound like, we all wrote papers in school.
Yeah.
And that's formal English. No one talks that way.
However, I will say that sometimes when I'm stuck on a line, I call it stripping it back to the studs. I'll do the strunk and white version of the line, and then once I get that in front of me, I proceed from there and try and make it more in character. Just because there's someone on the other end trying to understand the line too. So clarity is important too.
And I think sometimes the hardest lines are lines that are transitional. You're coming into the scene, you're going out of the scene. What is, you want to make it sort of flow into the next scene or establish something or end something. And so I think sometimes those are the hardest because those are sort of the most artificial. Those are not like real life, where you would just happen to meet someone on the street and say, hi, how are you? Nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. Instead, you're setting up something where you have, characters coming into a scene. I did you were the Batman episode, and, I had to have Batman and Katana come into the Batcave, and they'd been fighting Killer Croc in the sewers, and so I had to set up that they smelled bad. Well, so you have to sort of set up how that's going to play out, how fun that is, and, with the temple, they come in and Alfred just sort of cocks his head at them and sort of covers his nose, and so, that was, you have to write, you're writing that little sniff as a line of dialogue, but it's really it's a dialogue, it's an action, and it's sort of a way to introduce that scene, but I'm carrying over from the other scene. And sometimes those are the hardest, you'll sit there for it seems like hours trying to figure out, I just hate the line that the scene is going out on, and I want it to be really, especially if you're going out to like an act break that's going to lead to a commercial, you want it to be fairly memorable.
Yeah, and come completely from the situation. The button group scene generally needs to, needs to touch everything else in the scene if it can.
Do you guys have like a favorite line you still remember, or a moment or something you wrote that you were like, oh, that really worked?
It comes to mind, someone actually in a graphic novel that I wrote, somebody tweeted this panel with this line that was just kind of like a throwaway joke to me, and I guess it like really landed for this person. It was this mermaid graphic novel, and it was the girl in high school is meeting this merman, and she kind of asks him out, and he comes from Atlantis, so his English is not perfect.
He has an Atlantean accent.
He has an Atlantean. He speaks very formally. So he goes, so are you asking to be my mate? And she says, mate, what were you, homeschooled?
That's lovely.
It was nothing that I ever thought was like that funny, but I guess that was like funniest thing ever seen in a supernatural romance. A very narrow. Of funny lines.
Matt, you got one?
Well, there's one that has been said in the panel before. It's a pun. It's the Flash. There's been a big fight at the Flash Museum, and he's getting interviewed by TV, and was trying to comment on it. He scratches his head and he says, "No museum, no you don't." Bruce, think about it.
Actually, I can't think of a single gag kind of line that that really. I mean, there's some that I enjoyed writing because I thought they were just goofy, but I'm not. One of the early shows I worked on was a bizarre series called The Bionic Six. It always amazes me when people remember that. Because it never went into syndication or anything. It just played once. It wasn't on home video or anything.
It's one of my favorite shows.
Okay, I wrote 10 episodes of that series, and one of them, essentially the last episode, was really the next to last episode, are bad guys, because in those days it was a toy-driven show, and all that you couldn't defeat bad guys, you could just chase them away to the next episode. Our team of bad guys decided they were never going to defeat the good guys, so they opened up a dimensional portal to go to a different dimension where they could maybe be victorious bad guy. And they accidentally, for reasons I won't go into, they thought they were going into a dimension of all supervillains where they could be the kings of supervillainhood, but they accidentally changed the channel just before they went through the thing and ended up in a planet or a dimension of all superheroes. And the superheroes were overjoyed because finally they had bad guys to chase. And our heroes came after them because it was unraveling the walls between the dimensions or some other bullshit we put in for the episode to exist. And the good guys in the other dimension wouldn't let them take them away. And I wrote, and there was a line where good guys don't stop other good guys from stealing their bad guys. And it was just, it was a bizarre episode because every character had to be a superhero. So they went into a supermarket and there was Butcher Meat, the butcher, who had an atomic cleaver, and there was Nutrition Girl, who this was back when we had the dairy and meat. We had that pyramid of nutrition, and she juggled the items of the nutrition and used them as weapons, and Bad Boy wrapped all the bad guys in paper bags. And it was just this weird episode. But anyway, so that was my...
That was fun. Yeah. I wrote Atomic Cleaver as like Beaver Cleaver's forgotten brother. I had one that was really fun. I worked on a show years ago called Lunatics. It was a remaking of the classic Warner Brothers characters, but they were hip and new and did stuff, and the choice was made that the Roadrunner should talk, not my choice. And he talked very fast. He had a very fast pattern. He would talk about things like this, and he would always go on and on and on. And so I set up a situation in the script whereby the bad guy had put a nuclear device in the bumper pool table in their rec room. And when they discovered that there was a nuclear device in the bumper pool table, there was a very specific sequence of shots they could make on the bumper pool table to disarm the nuclear device. And the Roadrunner knew what the pattern was, and it was about a half a page worth of dialogue of like, you go in the corner packet, then I got the last tray, and then you got to hit the trick tray, and it was all this. Well, there's a very talented voice actor who played the Roadrunner named Rob Paulson. And normally what happens in the process is the voice actors get the scripts usually the day before because you want to make sure they're getting the latest version of the script. And many times the voice actors, they'll just peruse it and they'll put it aside and they'll go, the next day they'll show up, and so sometimes they'll stumble over stuff. Well, we got to this point in the script and I was kind of sitting there as, the writer nerd in the booth, like anticipating. And we get to that point and I see Rob turn the page and I was kind of like, we'll see how he does. And he did it in one take. He did it all in one take. He jammed through it. He got applause from everyone in the booth, all the other actors. And then to my surprise, he stood up and he held up the line of dialogue and he pointed at me and he goes, "That's for you, Mark. I worked 3 hours on this last night." that was my favorite because what I liked about it was it fit his character, it fit what was happening in there, and it fit that, you know, this crazy sort of bit of business. It had a visual element to it, and he recognized that too, and so it sort of fit with the character he developed as the Roadrunner. So that's the one I really think about.
And I think one of the important things there, I mean, beyond all the stuff you covered, is characters need to speak like the character they are. You know, is this a college professor? He should talk like a college professor. Is he a 3-year-old kid? He should talk like a 3-year-old kid. If you're, you know, you should kind of match the dialogue that you're writing to the personality of the character you're putting forth. Among other things, we don't have a lot of time to develop characters and characterization, and you can do a lot of that with how characters speak and the type of language they use. If you want to get really tricky, you could have a character who speaks a completely different way than you would expect, and suddenly that becomes a plot point in general. Now, this guy's supposed to have not graduated from the 3rd grade, but he talks like a humanities professor. You know, what does that mean? So I've got a question for the audience. How many of you are writers or want to be writers? I'm sorry. Or voice actors, okay. Then I have a question for you as a voice actor. If there are any other voice actors in here.
Voice actor.
Okay, talk funny. We got that.
Lasso.
There you go.
But I've also studied American Standard.
But, you know, there's a thing of it's an interesting discussion to have. What do the voice actors hate that writers do when they see, you know, when they get scenes? What do you not like? I don't know if there are any other voice actors in here who want to chime in on that.
There's a lot of stuff when we're scoring our scripts. If there's so much dialogue for like a whole block, sometimes when we're scoring our scripts, we might not have scored them the way you intended, because of the way that we're reading it, it doesn't jump off the page the way that it was written. Like if you put a period where some of us when we're reading it in a natural speech, that would be they would put the inflection on the end. It would be an exclamation, should be an exclamation point, and different things like that. Those are things that can hurt you.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I mean, in general, I think as you get more experience as a writer, you try not to lead the actor in a direction that you know so strongly that you want them to go. I know if there are moments where I really think they need to put a pause in the line, I'll put a parenthetical beat in there.
Yeah.
But that's usually, you know, just because I want it to come across as thoughtful, or they need a pause or whatever. But I think Matt would agree with this too, is that as you progress in your writing career, you just get, and you also realize that if you look at a page and you see a block of dialogue, you got to really think about, okay, maybe I probably didn't write this correctly if it's a scene between 2 or 3 people, that someone has this big long spiel.
Yeah, not everything has to be a monologue.
Yeah.
There's monologues, and then there's a flowing conversation. And also, throw out all grammar rules. That's what I did. My grammar kind of sucks anyway, so it's been easy. But just people speak in sentence fragments. You can start a sentence with and or but. That's perfectly fine. People interrupt each other. So I feel like a lot of my pages have like a lot of dashes where people are just jumping in and interrupting people. And sometimes people will just trail off and not even end their sentences. And that is how people talk. And when you have an ear for how people talk and you start picking up the nuances in speech, you can put them into your dialogue.
Speaking of breaking rules, this is something that it's a little nebulous, but it's you want to make sure. We were talking before that you don't want to keep repeating the same word too much. If there's an operative word, you keep repeating it. You also need to think like song lyrics almost. but one of the rules is, and I was just watching this country music Ken Burns thing that I had a full last week. It's perfect. And I had never really thought about Hank Williams before, but there's a song, I'm So Lonesome I Could Cry. He says, but he has gone behind a cloud to hide his face and cry, which of course is the exact same word as he's going to sing in the refrain too. So you're not really supposed to do that in lyrics. It's considered a no-no, and it's very, and writing dialogue is kind of the same thing that way. But if you're Hank Williams, you can do it. It reminds me of Paul McCartney in Hey Jude when he has shoulder twice in the same So I mean, break the rules of dialogue too when you've got an emotional impact that trumps it. I hope that was clear.
Yeah, I think building on that, I think that's why it's important if you want to be a writer to take out your writer tool set and read a lot. Read a lot of poetry. Yes. I've written a lot of poetry. Learn the meanings of onomatopoeia and alliteration. There are times when alliteration is good. There are times when alliteration is bad. But you find purpose in things like what comes to mind for me in repeating words is or phrases is Robert Frost stopping by the woods on a snowy evening. He repeats those last two lines. But I have miles to go before I sleep and miles to go before I sleep. That was very purposeful, but not only did people spend years analyzing why he did that, it's like you couldn't find another rhyme for sleep, but no, it was very purposeful, and
walking, you repeat stuff.
Right, and he's using his writer tool set in that poem to send a message, and you can do that in scripts and stuff like that. One aspect I wanted to just mention too is what a lot of people don't realize is we get a ton of notes on stuff too. And so sometimes you have to pick your battles as to where you're going to stand. If you get an executive note or you get a production note on something, a lot of times you'll get notes about, like, especially if you're writing for kids, you'll get a note about, I think this word is too sophisticated for our audience, or I think this word, and I have many times push back on notes like that because my feeling is like I learned where you learn words, or you're also encouraging a child or somebody to talk to the parent and say, what does that word mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you simplify it down
lose that battle a lot.
We do lose that battle a lot because people are afraid they won't understand it, and I've always thought, contextually you'll get it, and
they'll look it up and maybe learn a word.
Exactly. That's my feeling. And one time I was in a record, and it was on Lunatics, and the very great writer for Warner Brothers, Alan Burnett, was in the session, and one of the executives turned and said, that word, I don't remember what the word was, but I remember thinking it was just the best word. It just perfectly fit with the context and the character and everything. And the exec turned around and goes, I think that word's a little advanced. And I at the time was not the most senior writer or producer in the room, and I was like, I sort of swallowed hard, and I was like, okay, and I started to make a note, and I remember Alan leaned forward and he said, kid can crack a dictionary, can he? And the exec said, well, okay, we'll keep it. And I was like, wow. That would be a small victory for the writer.
Actually, you have to be Alan Burnett for that too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you'll have, so I'll tell you a Power Ranger story. Here was a very funny Power Ranger story for me. They had just recast a bunch of the actors, and they had the second Red Ranger was a guy named Rocky, and I wrote a script that was based on Rocky called Rocky Just Wants to Have Fun, where he was, a spell was put on him with an enchanted pachinko machine. It was based on the Japanese episodes. And so it's all about Rocky, right? There's a lot of stuff about Rocky. And the producer comes to me after I deliver the first draft and he goes, he was Israeli, and he says, Mike, we're having problems with the dialogue with Rocky. I said, Aaron Palm. Yes, he's not a very good actor. I said, you just cast him. This is like his first episode. I said, yes, but he's having problems. So I want you to take all his lines of dialogue and make them only 3 words or less. I was like, what? It's like this one you have on it Zordon, just make it on it Zordon. I'm like, the whole script is about Rocky. I don't know, but he's not good. So just The way that I written that was I found the most amazing ways to interject action in between each line of dialogue. Because Rocky had, lines, he had a couple monologues in that, so I would have Rocky say, "I'm not thinking." Rocky puts a hand to his chin pensively. Sometimes you get strange requests like that,
On Ken Sorbo, who was Hercules, and Kevin Sorbo, and then he had the show Andromeda, and now he was a big deal because he had starred in Hercules and had been successful. And someone told him that when you're in command, if you're the hero, you should always know what's going on and never ask questions. And so, since he was the star and one of the producers, he made a decree that his character would never ask a question. Which, when you're the commander of a ship and you have to say things like, is there anything on the sensors? Or, something like that. Just not a weakness, how are we going to get out of this question, but I need you to provide me with information kind of thing. He would not allow it. They had to write around that. And I don't say this to make fun of Kevin Sorbo, although I am. It's just, you get those kinds of things where you have to make it work for the rules of the production.
And I'm sure like 1 out of 4 times it was an actually legitimate thing to say I should be wrong.
Yeah.
But there's other things going on. It's always, a production is always like 15 different concerns. It also has to be specific. Like, I don't know if you guys know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did a show one time where the villain in the episode was sort of this medieval grand wizard kind of character. And at the end of the episode, he mistakenly thinks our heroes are powerful magicians when they're not. And he says, no, don't destroy me. He gives up. He says, don't destroy me, I beseech you. And I got a note saying we couldn't use the word beseech because they get letters, they projected that they would get letters from grandmothers in the South who would complain that we were being blasphemous. That was the word they used, blasphemous, because beseech sounds biblical. That is insane.
That's what I import to you?
No, I perhaps should have, but again, you pick the battles you want to fight, and I just said, well, that's dopey, but I changed it to, I beg of you, which is what I beseech thee.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, so it's out of character, he should have said beseech, but...
So that begot a whole... I was going to say we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I wondered if we could just say, do you have a favorite character in your mind? You say, I love writing for that character.
I really liked Sonic. I thought Sonic was like a great, snarky, fun character to write for, especially on Sonic Boom, which is such like a funny, snarky show.
Great.
I created and produced a show called Pocket Dragon Adventures about 18 years ago now. And we had a character who was just full of ideas. She was sort of an inventor character. And we wrote the character so that ideas were exploding out of her. It's like, oh, we could build one of these and we'll take one of the, oh wait, no, instead of that we could add wheels to it and just go on and on and on and just keep coming up with that, and it required someone who could talk really fast. And we found an actress who was so good at that. because you have to talk quickly and clearly enough that people understand what you're saying. And she could do it so much better than we thought that we could actually write much longer and funnier speeches for this character because we lucked into an actor who could perform.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's getting the right actor.
Probably staffing. I only got to write one animated thing with him. He's a milestone superhero who used to have a show.
For me, I'd say I've gotten to write several different iterations of Iron Man, both in like straight up animation for the MCU and also Lego versions of Iron Man and also Superhero Squad versions of Iron Man. And I've always found him fun because he can give you science stuff, he can be snarky, but he's also got somewhere in there under the mechanicalness, he's got a heart, and so it's always fun to write dialogue for Tony and Iron Man, and usually he's trying to be the leader, but he's also giving backhanded compliments and stuff. I just always have fun
He's got an
writing for Iron Man.
atomic heart.
Exactly.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Do we have any quick questions from the audience? Yeah, I see you. She's waving, saying we've only got a couple minutes left. Any quick questions before? Yeah, I know what she said.
What's the process like from writing to finally getting it done? I mean, like on episodes and animation and stuff like that. Like how long of a process is that? From writing, rewriting?
How long is the process of writing? Okay, well that's...
From writing and rewriting it, finally getting it on this.
Rewriting the script. And it, that's an interesting question. It's basic. Typically, you might have 2 to 3 weeks total for the process, and sometimes you may have 2 days for the process.
It's when they need it is the process.
But it's the basic process. If you start with a premise, which is 3 or 4 lines, you then you go, for a springboard, and then you go to a premise, which is usually half a page to a page. Then you go to an outline, which breaks all that down and is usually 8 to 10 pages, and then you go to a full script, which for 22 minutes is going to be somewhere between 30, 35 pages. And that whole process, with notes, with final, with going to record, can take anywhere from a few weeks to sometimes a few months.
I was on a show recently that had a very specific process for that. It was getting animated in Japan, Cannon Busters. We wrote all the scripts at once in English before they started any of the work on it. Then they translated all the scripts into Japanese. Then they animated it with the Japanese dialogue. Then they hired one of the usual people to shoehorn dialogue into. So it was about 3 years from start to finish, and there was another writer involved who was translating it from Japanese back into English and also making sure it matched the lip flaps from the Japanese version as much as possible.
A lot of it depends on the individual project and the company.
Yeah.
PBS shows frequently have very long schedules.
Yeah.
And I was story consultant on a Russian show a year ago where they told me they had done 2 seasons already when they brought me in to be story consultant for the 3rd season. I said, so you've been doing this for 2 years? And they said, oh no, 8 years.
Oh my God.
And it's like, okay.
So by the time it's on the screen, sometimes it's a little bit like driving drunk. And it's like, oh look, you made it home.
We can push our limit and take one last question if someone has one that's actually about dialogue.
I'm not sure if it's exactly about dialogue, but I was hoping if I can get 2 quick ones in. Do you mostly get work now by reputation? Or is it where producers come out and say, I need somebody to write this, and you send in copy? And then, of course, I would expect somebody to ask this. If somebody is really young and they want to get into business, what's the first thing they should do?
I definitely don't think we have time to answer the second part of that question.
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a complicated one. I think we've all been working a long time, so I think we get more work by reputation.
Yeah, I've worked for all 3 of these guys just because they know me.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of open call kind of thing when we're looking for a writer, but you can find out that shows exist, and then you can submit to it.
And then most of us have agents too, and so agents are, they're sort of a force multiplier with helping you get work and being eyes and ears and in places where, you're not necessarily going to hear about a show coming out of Europe looking for someone that needs writers, but they might, and then they can match up your skill set.
And I've gotten a lot of, more offers through LinkedIn. About 90% are happy, hey, write a show for us and we'll give you $10. But I've gotten like real work and, an ongoing relationship with companies overseas.
That's once you have credits.
In Asia. Yeah, once you have credit, and they find my profile and they're like, here's our show, and if they actually have money in a show that's going, I'll work for them. And it's been a great tool.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So they are flagellating us, and we're supposed to get off the stage. So.